Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Joanna Holden, and I am a fantasy author and an author tuber, and today we are going to be talking about creating a character arc that spans an entire series. A character arc is the growth and development that we see in a character mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually over the course of a book, or in this case, over a series. We see them growing, maturing, and then sometimes completely changing from the beginning of the plot to the end of the plot. Usually this change and maturity is inspired by what takes place in the plot, and it is also usually tied to subplots and other characters and how everything is impacting this character. Now, there are a myriad of resources out there, really awesome resources, all about crafting character arcs, how important they are, how to develop them, different steps that you can take to ensure that the character arc is compelling and that it makes sense. But most of these focus on the character arc that spans a single book, and it is much more difficult to try and craft a compelling character arc that stretches over an entire series. Because if you have a character who is going through all these adventures, book after book after book, they don't just change the one time in the first book and then stay the same the rest of the series. That would be incredibly boring and completely non-realistic. Rather, you need to see them continuing to change over the course of the series. But how do you do that? That's a lot to ask, especially if you have a book series that builds on itself. In other words, you can't read it out of order because it's happening across a very specific timeline and things are getting more complicated and more involved all the time. And so we're following this character through this journey over, in some cases, 10 or more books. So how in the world do you get a character arc to stretch over however many books you need it to? Today I am sharing with you my top 6 tips on crafting character arcs that span an entire series. Whew, and I'm so out of breath. Tip number 1 is to think of the character's arc as them maturing, not as them changing. Change indicates a complete switch from A to Z. Maturity indicates growth a little at a time, one step at a time, from point A to point B, then to point C, then to point D, and so on and so forth. This allows you a ton of room to maneuver around a series, because over the series, you're likely going to be dealing with pretty huge chunks of time. You are growing them a little bit at a time over the course of each book. So there's no real pressure that in each book there must be this great dynamic change from one kind of person into another kind of a person. Although in some cases that does happen, even within a series, like within one book of a series. Usually it doesn't happen within just one book of a series. Usually it happens, if it at all happens that drastically, over the course of the whole series. So thinking of it as maturing allows you to just take it a little bit at a time and to make smaller changes in each book rather than focus on a big, dramatic, life-changing change in each single book, because that will be very exhausting for that poor character and for your poor readers. Tip number 2, start off with plenty of flaws for your character, but only focus on a few of them in the first book. Again, this goes back to trying to change them completely in the first book. You don't want to get all of your change out of the way with in that book 1, because then there won't be anything left to change in the rest of the series. So if you start them off with a ton of flaws, still likable, with a ton of different flaws to work with, then you can slowly, a little bit, each book, bit by bit, chip away at those flaws, mature them past those flaws, and change those flaws. And if you start with enough at the beginning and you don't deal with them all in the first book, then you have a ton of material to work with. Tip number 3, start with point X in mind. Remember how I said the complete change from A to Z shouldn't happen all in one book, it should happen over the span of all of them? Well, if you're doing that, when you first sit down and start planning out the character arc, don't plan to take them all the way to Z, which is complete perfection, end of the change, they have learned their lesson and life is going to be wonderful here ever after. Aim to get more toward point X, which still leaves a few steps of change before they can have reached full maturity and full character development. This happens all the time, where an author will get to the end of a series and prepare to write their last book and realize that they need more room. There's too much happening in this last book to fit it into one book, and so they have to split it into 2 or even 3 books. Or they realize that there's a whole new arc to the plot that is fixing to leap off because of this last book, and they need another set of books in order to complete it. If you only plan to take your character to point X by the end of the series as far as character development goes, then you will still have several more points to work on over that next book or 2 books or the next series, whatever you are working with. And it will leave you lots of wiggle room, and you can expound on things. If you end up getting to that last book and you realize, you know what, this is the end of the book, this is the end of the series, it's okay if they go ahead and fully mature now. You can go ahead and skip and squish, X, Y, and Z all into that last book together. I just had a brilliant thought, and it was like, it's gone. I don't know where it went. I don't know where it went. It was here. Dang it. It was a really profound thought, too. Tip number 4, allow backsliding, not repeating a character arc. This does not happen very often in sequels, where we will see that the character has completed this beautiful arc over here in book 1. Now we're having them have a second arc in book 2. You really don't want to repeat the same arc that you just went through in the second book. However, in a series of 3 or more books, it is possible to allow a little bit of backsliding in the character growth, which naturally happens to all of us. We start moving forward and improving a part of ourselves, and then we get backslid and something happens, something stresses us out, something sends us spiraling, and we backslide into old habits and old flaws. That is okay in a series, because you have already brought them so far that a little bit of backsliding is not going to hurt the overall series. However, there are a few things that you will want to throw in to make sure that this does indeed look like a backslide and not like a repeated character arc. In other words, to make you look like a genius instead of like a lazy plotter. One thing would be to have them recognize that they are falling back into their old habits. Maybe even be upset at themselves for falling back into those old habits and flaws. Secondly, as they fight to come back out of these old habits, have them use a different approach, a new technique, or maybe draw on inspiration from a different source than they did the first time they were trying to come out of these old habits and old flaws, so that it definitely does not look like a repeat. And thirdly, it would be to make sure that when you do bring them out of these old habits and old flaws, you actually progress them farther in their character development than they got the last time that they were in that place. So it's not at all a repeat of the cycle, it's actually an improvement, and it's pushing them forward even farther into their character development arc. Also, very important, make sure that the audience completely understands that this backsliding is natural, that it is to be expected given the circumstances that they are in, maybe the pressure that they're under. Again, stress can do this to people. Being sent spiraling by crazy life happenings can cause this. Sometimes retreating back into sets of circumstances that remind you of where you were in a very powerful negative way. All of those are good reasons, traumatic life experiences too. All of those are good reasons to fall back into old habits and old flaws. Make sure that the audience sees this clearly, though, and that maybe even they get a sense of, oh crap, they're going back again because of this. That this is the reason that the character is falling back into these old habits, not just I'm repeating the cycle because I couldn't think of anything else. Tip number 5, and this is going to be a cringe moment for you pantsers, but please hear me out. Tip number 5 is, if possible, plan out your character arc in advance. This will be super easy if you've already got the entire book series planned out and you know how many books it's going to be and what the plot overall is going to be. But whether or not you have the whole series plot figured out or not, you can still sit down and kind of map out the arc that you want the character to take. So the way that I usually do this is I will actually take a piece of paper and I will draw a physical arc. And I'll write where I want the character to start and where I want them to end, and then some points throughout the arc where they start to make those changes. Then once you do know the plot of the series, how many books you're going to have, or at least some idea, then you can start plugging those books into that arc. So book number 1 will cover this section, book number 2 will cover this section, book number 3 will cover this section, so on and so forth. Have them reach some kind of satisfying end to that particular chunk of arc at the end of each book, so that the audience still feels satisfied. Like this was a well-rounded arc within the book. If it helps, you know what? Where's a pen? Okay. If it helps when you're actually physically drawing out an arc, or whether you use a computer document or whatever you use, this is what it may end up looking like. Okay, I just drew this for the example, so please no judging. But as you can see, I've drawn the arc, and then I have drawn the little natural breaks, almost like flower petals. And then I have assigned a certain set or one of those for each of these books in this imaginary series. So if it helps, draw out little chunks so you can see here's where they start, they're going to have an arc with lots of development, and here's where they're going to end. And it's actually going to be an end of an individual arc within the series arc. I hope that makes sense. This means that you may need to apply more than one mini arc to a whole book, which then you'll kind of want to blend the end of one arc and the beginning of the next, if it happens like in the middle of the book or whatever, so that it looks like one cohesive arc within the book instead of 3 chunks crammed into one. But either way, however many of those little mini arcs or chunks of arc fit into the book that match the story that work for that particular part of the series, just go for it. There are no rules here. These are just helpful hints. And finally, my tip number 6, which actually can theoretically be applied to a standalone book as well, is to try, if possible, to match your character's growth with their goal. This will help tremendously when you are trying to make each individual book have its own individual arc while still having it span over the entire series and feel cohesive instead of feeling all broken apart. If character has a specific want, something that they really want or need that is going to be their end goal for the series, have their growth intertwine with that and have them both stretch out over the series. But within each book, try to have them have one specific goal for that book. They want or need or must do this one thing inside that book. And then with that goal, intertwine the character arc. Have them affect each other. Their goal affects their growth. Their new maturity affects how they view their goal or how they're going to go about obtaining that goal. And this will help each individual book to feel whole, to feel satisfying, and very much not to feel like a bridge book, which is that annoying book in the middle of a series that does nothing but get you from one book to the other book. I have a whole video on how not to write a bridge book. Try to remember to put that in the cards or maybe in the description box below. But this is one excellent way to keep from writing a bridge book and to affect the whole series is that each individual book has a goal and growth that intertwine together and affect each other and come to a satisfying conclusion at the end. Even if there's a cliffhanger at the end, there's still a satisfactory conclusion to the goal and to the character growth. Even if that means that they did not reach that goal, and that is part of what their growth is about. It's about accepting not being able to reach that goal or about being inspired to change goals or to go after the goal a second time. Whatever works for that particular book. And again, try to have a goal that spans the entire series and have their overall arc intertwine with that and affect that so that, again, bouncing back and forth off each other, they make a nice tight-knit story within the story that will bring the readers back to every single book and compel them to keep reading no matter what. Well, that is all that I have for you today. Those are my 6 tips on crafting character arcs that span an entire series. I hope you enjoyed it. If you do, make sure to click the like and consider subscribing on the way out. I do post writerly content every week, sometimes more. You may want to click that notification bell if you're interested in seeing more because sometimes I post bonus videos. And I have a feeling that there will be quite a few bonus videos coming up as I am working through my post-writing process and displaying that here on YouTube for all of you to see. My debut middle grade fairy tale retelling is now available in ebook and paperback. Links in the description box below. And if you want to know anything more about me or these services that I offer for other writers, as well as some of the awesome free downloads that I have for planning a series, then check the description box below. My social media and my website are also down there, so you can check those out as well. I hope that you have an amazing rest of the weekend writing, and as you go about plotting your series, I hope that this helped you. I will see you all in my next video. Bye!